Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me. Today we are going to be talking about the thesis and dissertation program at University of Washington and how copyright and your potential publishing plans can have an effect on that process. My name is Liz Bedford, and I am the Scholarly Publishing Outreach Librarian based in Seattle. And today I'm going to have Carolyn Ostler, who's the Scholarly Communication and Publishing Student Specialist, helping me out moderating in Zoom. So thank you so much, Carolyn. Now, I am not a lawyer and I can't give legal advice, but for today, we are going to be starting up by talking about copyright within the United States, looking at the law that governs how materials that have what's called a modicum of creativity are covered and protected under US law. We're also going to be talking about the publishing process, particularly around contracts and how you as a copyright holder give permissions to publishers to distribute your work. And then we're going to bring it all together and talk about the UW's Electronic Thesis and Dissertation, or ETD program. Now, the reason that we're doing this is because I want you to have a really good sense of the kinds of spheres that will be governing the work that you are creating. So it's important to think about essentially the rules in a number of different contexts. So of course we have the legal rules that you need to be conforming to, and this is under US law. This is what copyright is. We also need to think about particular contracts, and this is going to be the central issue that you're facing in the publishing process. But then also, it's really important to think about the UW context. So there is UW policy that's going to be affecting how you are able to share this work. Your department may have policies around how you use material within your dissertation. And then, of course, as part of an academic community, we want to be cognizant of the community norms that you should be following when you are creating the scholarship. So let's start by digging into copyright. So copyright is a set of exclusive rights that are given to the copyright holder. This is a bundle of activities that only the copyright holder is allowed to do under US law. So these uses are things like making copies of the work, that's why it's called copyright, creating derivative works, and then distributing, displaying, and performing them as well. Now, what gets copyrighted? Within the US Code, what's called a modicum of creativity is necessary in order for a work to be given copyright. Now, it's also really important that the work be written down or recorded in some way. It needs to be in a tangible form. So if I were to hum a tune right now, for example, if I were just doing that by myself, that tune would not be eligible for copyright. However, if I were to record it as we are recording this workshop, or if I were to mark down the notations of that tune, once it gets into a tangible form, that's when the copyright gets enacted. This will happen automatically, and it's really important to remember that. Registration of copyright is a process that you can go through as a copyright holder. However, it does not affect the copyright itself. Copyright is automatic within the United States and essentially instantaneous from when you create the work. Now, there are some exceptions to copyright. This includes things like facts. So, saying the sky is blue today is not a copyrightable statement. However, the expression of a fact, if I put some creativity into the description of that fact, for example, that's when the work becomes copyrightable. Same thing with ideas. You can have an idea, but that idea itself cannot be copyrighted. It is only the expression and the creative expression of that idea that gets your copyright. Another really important thing to note is that within the United States, any US government materials do not get copyrighted. They get automatically put into the public domain. So if you end up working for the US government, just be advised that the work that you produce there does not get copyright protection. Now, another really important thing to note is that copyright is automatic within the United States. So as soon as you write down or record this creative work, the work itself has copyright. Now, under US law, the copyright goes to the creator of the work unless you have explicitly beforehand said that that work will go to someone else. So if you, in your your future job contracts, sometimes owners will say that anything that you create within the context of your work, you will be giving the copyright to them. That's called a work for hire. Copyright can be co-owned between people. So if you're working with someone else, if both of you add substantial value to the outcome, then you are co-creators and have equal rights to do those protected activities that I talked about earlier. Now here at UW, copyright is governed by Executive Order 36. And what that means is that US students own your copyright explicitly. So when you write your thesis, or dissertation, you have the copyright to it already. Now, it's also important to note that copyright has a time limit attached to it. Normally, it is the life of the creator plus 70 years. So for your own work, you have the copyright, but this is important to note when we're thinking about incorporating other people's material into your work, especially if you're in the humanities and using older materials. Potentially that work could be in what's called the public domain. It is sometimes tricky figuring out what's in the public domain, but if it is in the public domain, you no longer have to worry about a copyright holder having exclusive rights, and you can use that material in any way that you wish. Now, another really important thing to distinguish is this idea of accessing a work versus using a work. So I said that copyright was the exclusive right for those five uses. Access is not one of those exclusive rights. So just as, if we go to the New York Times website and see a photograph, you can absolutely look at that photograph, read the material, but that does not give you the right to then take that photograph or those words and use it in your own work. And the opposite is true. If you put something out on the internet, folks can see it, but they do not have the legal right to use it in any of those protected ways unless you explicitly give them the permission to. So if you are incorporating other people's creative works into your thesis or dissertation, you need to have permission from the copyright holder if that work has copyright protections attached to it, if it is not in the public domain. So you can do this either having a Creative Commons license attached to that work. If you get an individual permission from the creator of that works fine. Or if you are unable to contact the creator of the work, there's an exception to copyright law called fair use that in some very specific instances lets you use the work even if you don't have explicit permission, but we will get into that in a minute. It's also important to again think about the sort of different spheres that we need to be mindful of. So there are the legal considerations of copyright, but then there's also just scholarly best practice and thinking about how to credit folks and knowing that many times within this context, the people whose work you are going to be using are potentially your future collaborators. So really essentially treat them how you would like to be treated, giving credit either as a citation or potentially as you move forward, thinking about co-authorship and giving credit that way. I said that there were a few instances in which copyright exceptions can occur. Under US copyright law, fair use is a concept that was deliberately left fairly vague and open to interpretation. And the way that they framed it is that there are 4 factors that when you are considering whether a use is fair or not, you should take into account. So the first one, the purpose and character of the use, one of the classic thinking about whether it's fair or not is this a commercial use or is this educational use? If it is a commercial use, then it is less likely to be fair use. If it's an educational use, it is more likely to be fair use. The nature of the copyrighted work itself, the copyright law gives more protections to previously published work than to unpublished work because they want the creator work to essentially have the first dibs on publishing that work. The amount used, so if you are using what's sometimes called the heart of the work, both the percentage of what you are using in comparison with the entirety of the work, and also how central that selection is to the meaning of the wider work. Obviously, if what you're using is smaller, that is more likely to be fair use. There is not a written down percentage, however, and that's a question that we get a lot. Unfortunately, there are no hard and fast rules there. Finally, the effect on the value of the original work. So are you essentially going to be competing with your work in the marketplace against that original work? It's particularly important to know that not knowing is not a legal justification for using material inappropriately. And even if your use is fair, you must have legally obtained the original in order for the use to be fair. So if you are using a bootleg video, for example, even if how you end up using it could be considered a fair use, the fact that the bootleg is what you're starting from means that it is not legal. It's also really important to note that just because we're in an educational realm does not mean that your use is automatically fair use. You need to go through all four factors very carefully, and there are many instances where something is educational use, but is not actually fair use. I'd like to break out, excuse me, into small group sessions now. So I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen for this portion because I'm hoping that folks have some questions for me. So how are folks feeling about this concept of copyright, and what questions are coming up for you, particularly around the work that potentially you are incorporating into your thesis or dissertation? And feel free to either unmute yourself, or if you'd like to type your question into the chat, I'm happy to look there as well.
I had a question that came up in the breakout room. Just how does copyright work with data? You know, if you're like, I'm a social scientist, so I have interview data and survey data and observations and things like that that I analyze and use in my work. But I'm just curious, like, is there a relationship between copyright and data?
Yeah, absolutely. So data as facts do not get copyright protections. However, the organization of facts can have copyright protections. So if you are, the surveys that you use to collect your data, for example, very much do have copyright protections attached to them. This is one of those issues where it's kind of a case-by-case differentiation. So if you do have data that you are interested in, I'd be very happy to talk with you and go over what the potential copyright implications are. Were there other general copyright questions?
Well, to follow up on the one with the data, for qualitative, like interview-based, if you have a sort of like a big chunk of interview, I mean, I've always sort of assumed that you wouldn't take, you know, someone's other, like the interview data they collected and reuse that. So does that like sort of build off what you were saying with I know you mentioned surveys specifically, like the tools that we create, but the actual, chunks of interviewers and like responses from our interviewees, where do they fall under certain protections?
So that's actually a really interesting one. And one of the reasons that when you are doing that kind of interview, it's really important to include within your consent forms, if you anticipate incorporating direct quotes into your work or sharing that, it's very possible that the quotes themselves have copyright protection. They are an original expression of the people that you are interviewing, and as such, those quotes that the interviewees have copyright to the recorded expression. So getting consent forms that include the right for you to include their words in a publication is really, really important. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much.
I also have a question. So I overheard a question about the use of data. I think I missed that part, sorry. So I have experimental data where I do experiments on my animal models, and then I have collected electrophysiology data from them. And my question is, does that have copyright, or is that also regarded as facts where I should just share it with everybody and and it doesn't have copyright?
I think that I would need to look more specifically, but if for example, you are describing, the color of a particular, I don't know what you're actually working on, but if you are describing something that's happening, if you're simply recording what you are seeing, then that probably does not have copyright protection. However, there's also a kind of separate issue. Just because something does not have copyright protection does not mean that you should or should not share it. So the sharing question is actually a separate one from the copyright question. And the sharing has to do with, your wanting to be reproducible. Potentially, there could be requirements from your funders about whether you're sharing your data or not. If you're working with human subjects, privacy can come into that, which would make it more difficult to share. But yeah, we can follow up offline if you're interested in continuing that conversation. I do want to keep going because we've got quite a lot more. So as I said, those exclusive rights that are given to the copyright holder include things like making copies, distributing, and really this is what the heart of publishing is, right? It is taking something that somebody else has authored and using your infrastructure to share that work with a large audience. Now, because under US copyright law, the right to do that is explicitly and exclusively the copyright holders. If you want somebody else to do that distribution for you, you have to give them permission. And the way that we do that in the United States is through a license. A license is a kind of contract, and it is essentially an agreement between you, the copyright holder, and someone else. This can be done in a couple of ways. It can be between the copyright holder and a particular individual or group. So working with a particular publisher, you can have a license that is only between you and the publisher. However, a really interesting development in the last 20 years or so is this idea that potentially we would want to have a mechanism for more universal licensing. So as a copyright holder saying, these are the uses that I am already comfortable with, and attaching a license that lets everyone know that you are okay with those uses. So this is where Creative Commons licenses come in. Hopefully the third-party material that you are incorporating into your work could also have a Creative Commons license on it. And that means, again, that you do not have to contact the copyright holder because they have already told you how they are comfortable with folks using their work. When you are looking at your publishing contract, there are a number of sections that you need to be aware of. So again, there needs to be some mechanism by which you as a copyright holder give the publisher the right to distribute your work. And that's going to be potentially called the grant of rights section. Now, there are a couple of ways that can happen, and I will talk about that again in a second. But another section to watch out for are what's called the retained rights. So these are explicitly things that you as the author are saying that I still want to be able to do at the end of this contract. You will also be probably asked to, promise that yes, I am the original author of this work, and that this work does not infringe on others' rights of privacy or intellectual property, that sort of thing. And then there could be additional terms as well. So I think one of the major themes for this session is read your contract. In any scenario, read your contract and just have a good sense of what exactly is going on there, because that will govern your ability to use your work afterwards. Because as I said, there are a couple of ways that publishers can ask you to give them the rights to use your work. So the most restrictive way is through an explicit transfer of copyright. So sometimes publishers will say, yes, we need those rights and we are going to ask you to transfer the copyright. And while that mechanism does give them the rights that are necessary, at the end of that transaction, you no longer have your copyrights. So you do not have the right to distribute and to make derivative works and to do these things that are pretty integral to how you're going to want to use your work. And especially if you have already published and are thinking about incorporating this into your thesis or dissertation, including that material in your dissertation is a protected use. So if you have transferred your copyright, you need to explicitly get permission from the publisher in order to incorporate it into your thesis or dissertation. Now, the other mechanism that can be used is called a non-exclusive license. And what this does, and this is going to be the way that you will give permission to UW and to ProQuest to share your thesis or dissertation in the ETD administrator process. The non-exclusive license gives the other person the rights that are necessary to distribute, but you are left with all of the rights that you are started with. That you started with. So you can continue to use your material as you wish, including by entering into other contracts and licenses. So because we're doing a non-exclusive license with UW and with ProQuest, that means that you can then enter into a contract with your publisher afterwards. Another thing to think about outside of the contract system, especially for journals, is that oftentimes they will have policies, again, outside of the contracts, somewhere on their website, oftentimes called a copyright policy or a sharing policy or an archiving policy, that will give authors some more rights, even if they have completely transferred their copyright. However, it's really important to note in these sharing policies that essentially journals get much more protective of the material the more involvement they have with it. So for example, if you submit material, your first draft essentially, most of the time publishers are pretty lax about what you do with that work. However, once it's gone through the peer review process, and especially once the finalized version has gone through the editing and typesetting process, oftentimes journals will get much more protective about those versions. So when you're looking at the sharing policies or the archiving policies, just pay attention to which version they're talking about, because it can be very different. Oftentimes journals will also have preferences about how the form of use that you're talking about. So not-for-profit uses, which putting something on your personal website, putting it into UW's institutional repository, those are not-for-profit institutions. However, ProQuest is a for-profit company. And so putting your work into ProQuest, which is part of the ETD process, is something to be aware of if the publisher states that they are comfortable with non-commercial uses only. So if they do say non-commercial, you're potentially going to have to get explicit permission to put it into ProQuest. Now, the good news here is that you can always try to negotiate your contract. And the way that I recommend that you do that is by using an established author's addendum. The SPARC organization has a really great and legally vetted author's addendum that I'm linking to in the slide deck here, that essentially you fill that out and attach it to your publishing contract. And what it does is it's an add-on that says, okay, yes, I give you the rights that you need in order to publish, but I explicitly want to keep these rights as well. So if you are able to add this author's addendum to your contract, then that's one way of keeping rights in general for how you want to use your work, but also specifically for being able to incorporate something into your thesis or dissertation. Let's have another breakout session here. Okay. So then, as we're coming back together, what questions are coming up for you? Okay, so we've got a question here. Is it better to write a thesis for publication in a specific journal or to find a journal afterwards? That's an interesting question. I think that probably talking to your advisor about that is a good way of thinking about it. I think that having a sense of where, of whether there is an audience for your work is always going to be a good thing. But it's important to remember that oftentimes it takes a couple of tries in order to get published. And so potentially your first choice in publication venue, you won't get into. Does that answer the question? It's unfortunately not a great answer, but we also had a question about group authorships. And if you're working together with another group on a collaborative journal article, how do you properly use and credit another group's work in a dissertation? In general, granting authorship within the journal context is going to be kind of a different calculation than authorship of your thesis or dissertation. And it's really important that you know that your department or degree program's preferences around that. There are some degree programs who say you must be the sole author of any material that's part of your thesis or dissertation. But that's going to be dependent on the department. You know, we know that there are many fields where you can't do research without the input of many people. My suspicion is that having a sort of credits section within your thesis or dissertation, explaining what other people's contributions to the work are, is a really good thing.
Yeah, I have a question about, like for my dissertation, I have a publisher that is already interested in publishing it as a book, right? And so how do I negotiate that in relationship to like publishing the dissertation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it, you know, it might be happening around the same time, right? So if it's already out there and available through like ProQuest,
Mm-hmm.
but my publisher wants, you know, like can they ask to not have it published in ProQuest?
Yeah. So it is a requirement of your graduation that that your work be made ultimately available. We are a public institution, and it's important that the scholarship that is produced here is available to our community. However, you will get the chance to determine the timing on that, and that's something that we're going to get to in a minute. So potentially putting an embargo period on your thesis or dissertation. Oftentimes the book publisher will be fine with that, but being really explicit with them during your negotiations that the dissertation will need to be made available at some point. That's just, that needs to be part of the conversation from the start. It's also the case, I've talked to UW Press, for example, who say that dissertations are not the same thing as published books. There is going to be a substantial amount of revision, and the audiences are going to be different. Dissertations are very, very focused on academics, whereas books presumably want to try and reach a wider audience. So there are going to be differences there as well. But yeah, it does need to be, the dissertation does need to be made available, and your publisher will need to be aware of that.
Great, thank you.
So let's come to, let's put it all together. The Electronic Thesis and Dissertation Program is a partnership between the libraries and the graduate school. And we talk to each other all the time. So if you have questions that one of us is better suited to answer and you get the wrong person, please don't worry about it. We can get you to the right person. But in general, the libraries is focused on answering questions around publishing and copyright and open access, and around the availability of your work in ResearchWorks, UW's institutional repository. Whereas the graduate school can answer questions about your graduation requirements, how the upload process works. They have very specific requirements for the first 3 pages of your thesis or dissertation. And so working with them about how to interpret that. And if after you submit, you feel like there needs to be a change in the content, they're the ones who are going to say yes or no to that. So you're going to need to work with them there. But again, we talk to each other all the time, and we can find you the right person regardless of your question. ProQuest ETD Administrator, the online platform that you're going to use to upload your work and to essentially get the graduation process started. In terms of publishing, that single platform ends up putting your material in 2 different places. The first is in ProQuest's Electronic Thesis and Dissertations database, which is a closed subscriber database. So once it goes into ProQuest, anyone who is associated with an institution that has a subscription to that database will have access there. However, as I said, because we are a public institution and we want the scholarship of UW shared with the world, your work will also go into ResearchWorks, which is UW's institutional repository. And eventually that material will be made openly available on the web. And because there are these 2 places that your work ends up, you're going to have to, unfortunately, do some duplication or seeming duplication in the things that you fill out in ETD Administrator. So you're going to need to put 2 different answers to how you want your work accessed. Unfortunately, we are unable to, we do not have control over the options that ProQuest gives you, and they are not the options that we have decided we want to offer in ResearchWorks. We can talk about sort of the combination of those 2 options, but in general, just remember that you need to think about when material is available on 2 separate platforms. So yes, so thinking about it, that within the ResearchWorks branch of the workflow, you can have completely closed access. You can make it available to only the UW community, and that's going to be a net ID restriction layer. UW is a subscriber to ProQuest. So if you make the material available on ProQuest, that includes the UW community. And then again, ResearchWorks is going to be the place where it is available openly on the web. The complete embargo within ResearchWorks, you can do that up to 1 year. However, for folks who are interested in publishing that takes a longer timeline, potentially that's often the case when we're talking about books, that UW only restriction, which again is quite small, you can do that up to 5 years. And for most of the time, publishers are fine with that because it's not available openly on the web.
I have a question about the embargo. So do we need to like in talks with the IRB, or it just like depends on the decision to make embargo or not? Yeah.
So your IRB, this is incredibly important. Thank you so much for bringing it up. Because your dissertation or thesis must be made openly available, it's really important to only include material that IRB has said is appropriate to share openly. So if you have protected information as part of your dissertation or thesis, you may need to work with the grad school, work with your advisors to figure out how to exclude it from the dissertation that's published, because it must be made openly available. There have been cases where essentially mistakenly protected information has ended up in a thesis, and the libraries has worked with the graduate school to essentially create a workaround for that. But we really want to prevent that from happening because, again, we want these materials to be made openly available. Again, we talked about these publishing agreements. Again, you're going to be signing 2 of them, one for ProQuest and one for UW. Both of these agreements are non-exclusive licenses. So again, you will still have the rights to enter into contracts later on with other publishers. You're also going to be given the option to select a Creative Commons license. And again, this is something where if you know that you're comfortable with other people using your work in certain ways, so if you know that you're okay with folks reusing your work if it's not in a commercial context, for example, it's really a gift to your future users to tell them that in advance. And that's what Creative Commons licenses can do for you. There is a broad range of licenses. The strictest one basically says, I will allow you to email a PDF of my work to your friend. So you can share the in the attribution, non-commercial, no derivatives license. It is essentially a way of more easily sharing your work and letting other people share your work as a whole. Whereas Creative Commons attribution, CC BY, is a much more permissive license. You're basically saying, I am okay with you using my material in any way as long as you credit me for it. So this is something that a lot of people have questions about, and basically I'm super happy to speak with you individually about that because there's a lot to think about there. Now, another thing that I want to make sure to get in, you're going to be asked about registering your copyright. This is a service that ProQuest offers to essentially record your existing copyright with the Library of Congress. So this does not mean that you need to do this in order to have copyright because you have that copyright already. The registration is sort of an additional layer of protection that can be helpful, but it does not affect the central protections that copyright law gives you to your work. Another thing to note is that you can do the registration yourself at copyright.gov/registration, and it'll be probably like $20 cheaper, I think. And again, I'm happy to answer questions about that afterwards. But a few last things. If you are using your dissertation as the basis for a submission to an article or a book, that is not a copyright violation because, again, you are the copyright holder and you have the right to make a derivative work. However, you need to be really clear with your editor that you are basing this work off of your thesis or dissertation. So it's not technically plagiarism, but sometimes folks your publishers might have issues with it. So it's always really crucial to be clear with them. Most publishers are in fact okay with having an openly available version online, again, because the peer review process does change the work significantly. And if they're not, then that's where the embargoes come in. And again, you have up to 5 years for UW protection, which is again a very small section of the internet in comparison. Now, I do want to note that if you are interested in publishing as a monograph, most of the time publishers really want you to distinguish it from the dissertation. So do not put your awesome title on the dissertation because you cannot reuse it as the monograph. Save your creative titles for the monograph and just call your dissertation something descriptive because they will not let you reuse it. Now, if you're using an article that you've previously published in your dissertation, it's really important to be clear. Read your contract, try to keep your copyright so that you already have the explicit permission to put it in your dissertation. If you haven't done that, you are going to need to contact your editor or your publisher and get that explicit permission to put it in your thesis or dissertation. And again, the grad school requirements for the first 3 pages of your dissertation include this copyright page. And that's going to be if you have previously published the work and if you've previously transferred your copyright, that's where you're going to reflect that. So depending on the chapter, you can say that they are copyright different organizations and then the rest of it is your own, for example. But again, your department is going to have potentially things to say about the authorship, the formatting and citations. Really, the libraries and the grad school only care about those first 3 pages in terms of formatting and everything else is up to the department. Many departments don't actually have set rules, and so we can talk about if you need guidance around that, we can talk about that. But the basic level is that pick something and be consistent, and that will certainly suffice for the grad school and the libraries and most likely suffice for your department as well. Major takeaways: read your contracts. You do own the copyright to your dissertation and to your articles when you first write them. And that eventually your thesis or dissertation must be made completely openly available. And so you need to have conversations with your publishers about that potentially, but you do get to control when that happens. And as always, I and my colleagues are here to help. We would be delighted to hear from you. I don't think we have time for questions, I'm so sorry, but please email me. I'm happy to answer over email or set up other individual sessions with folks. I'm including a bunch of guides here that have a lot of really useful information, and also both my email address and the email address for the Wide Area Libraries ETD team. Thank you so much for attending today. I look forward to hearing more questions from you in the future, and good luck with your thesis and dissertation process. So thanks, everyone.